So if we go back to the summer of 1988, there was this massive, massive event. Yellowstone National Park burned.
Oh, yeah, the big one.
Right, exactly. I mean, nearly 800,000 acres were just gone. That's roughly 36% of the entire park reduced to absolute unrecognizable ash.
It was devastating. I mean, the news coverage at the time.
It was completely apocalyptic.
Right, yeah.
The public basically thought, America's crown jewel was dead forever. It was framed as this ultimate tragedy. But, and here's the crazy part, what happened next didn't just rebuild a forest. It fundamentally completely rewrote human psychology and really what it actually means to survive a disaster.
Because when the smoke finally cleared, ecologists realized the fire wasn't an executioner at all. It was an incredibly brutal but necessary architect.
Exactly. And that is exactly where we're starting today. So welcome to the deep dive. If you are joining us today, and we always, always love having you, the learner, right here with us, we are bypassing all that standard cliche advice about, just getting through hard times.
Yeah, no platitudes today.
Right. We are pulling insights directly from the pioneering work of ecologist Buzz Halling, looking specifically at nature's blueprint for resilience. Because if you've ever felt completely exhausted trying to act like a brick wall against the storms of your life, well, you're going to want to hear this.
I think what's really fascinating here is that Holling's work completely dismantles our default human response to trauma and shock.
How so?
Well, we have this ingrained belief, right?
Yeah.
That when a crisis hits, our job is to act like a fortress wall. Stand your ground, repel the attack, remain flawlessly unchanged.
The ultimate stoic ideal, like you take the hit, you don't even blink, and everyone stands around and applauds your resilience.
Oh, right, exactly. But Holling's research proves that from an ecological standpoint, that kind of rigidity is actually a blueprint for catastrophic failure.
Wait, really? Catastrophic failure?
Oh, absolutely. The living world doesn't survive a billion years of, asteroid strikes and ice ages and wildfires by standing perfectly still. It survives precisely because it allows itself to be fundamentally altered.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to translate this into our own lives, to make it useful for you listening right now, we need to understand the exact mechanics of how an ecosystem handles trauma. And Halling draws a massive, heavy line in the sand between two concepts, right? Resistance and adaptation.
Yeah, this is the core paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Let's look at resistance mechanically for a second. Think of metallurgy.
Okay. Like making swords or something.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to make a piece of steel incredibly resistant to scratching or bending, you harden it. You heat it way up, and then you quench it rapidly. It becomes so hard that it absolutely will not flex.
Right.
But the trade-off, and this is the crucial part to understand, is that it becomes incredibly brittle. If a force comes along that exceeds its resistance threshold, it doesn't just bend. It shatters into a million pieces.
Because it has, like, zero capacity to absorb the kinetic energy. It has to deflect all of it or it just dies.
Exactly. That is resistance.
Yeah.
It takes immense energy to maintain, and its failure mode is totally catastrophic.
Sure.
Now, contrast that with the metallurgical process of annealing.
Annealing, right.
Right. So you heat the metal and you let it cool very, very slowly. This relaxes the internal stresses. The metal becomes softer, more malleable. I mean, it will dent, it will bend, but it's remarkably difficult to actually break.
So it survives the impact by allowing its shape to be changed by the impact.
Precisely. And that is ecological adaptation. When we look at a forest encountering a massive wildfire, like Yellowstone, the ecosystem doesn't try to resist the fire.
Right, it can't.
Exactly. It is entirely consumed by the old structures incinerated. But it uses the thermal energy and the nutrient-rich ash of that trauma as the literal operating system for its next iteration.
Okay, wait, I have to challenge this right out of the gate.
Sure, go for it.
Because, I mean, this sounds beautiful in a textbook, but let's apply this to actual human life. If a lush ancient forest burns to the ground and is replaced by a scrubby barren grassland, sure, technically life survived, the ecosystem adapted, but the forest is dead. At what point is adaptation just a nice academic word for losing everything you cared about?
That is the exact friction point of this entire theory, and it is a brilliant question. You are hitting on Holling's concept of ecological state changes.
Yeah.
You're right, the forest, as it was, is completely gone. But Holling's work on what he calls the adaptive cycle explains why that destruction is structurally necessary.
Structurally necessary. Walk me through that. The adaptive cycle.
So Holling mapped out ecosystem behavior as an infinity loop with 4 phases. First, there's rapid growth. He calls this exploitation.
Okay, growth. Got
Then
it.
comes conservation, where the system matures and locks up all its resources. Think of an old-growth forest where a massive canopy blocks all the sunlight and all the nutrients are just trapped in the trunks of these ancient trees.
Right, so the system is highly efficient, but
But incredibly rigid.
yeah,
Nothing new can grow.
it's totally maxed out.
It is entirely hardened. Which brings us to the third phase. Release.
It's fire.
The fire. The storm. The collapse. The deeply uncomfortable phase where all those locked-up resources are violently freed. Which then sets the stage for the final phase, reorganization, the scrubby grassland you mentioned earlier.
So the fire isn't an interruption of the cycle. It is an active, necessary mechanism of the cycle.
Exactly. Without the release phase, the system literally suffocates on its own rigidity. To bring us back to your challenge, yes, adapting might mean you lose the specific forest of your current life.
Like a career you held for 20 years.
Right. Or a relationship that defined you. But the alternative is trying to maintain a completely hardened, resource-starved system that will eventually just shatter.
Man, that reframes so much of the pain we feel during major life transitions.
It really does.
Because we treat that release phase as an error, like, oh, I got laid off, something is fundamentally wrong with the universe. But Holling is saying the release phase is mandatory to free up the capital, whether that's ecological nutrients or your personal time, your energy, your identity. It frees that up for the reorganization phase.
It is the annealing process. It requires the heat and the melting down of the old structure to forge something capable of surviving the next era.
So if resilience isn't about resisting the fire, but rather ensuring you have the capacity to reorganize after it, what gives a system that capacity?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. If a whole forest is going to bend and adapt, how does it actually pull that off on a mechanical level? Holling points to one very specific architectural feature, doesn't he?
He does. And the secret entirely comes down to biodiversity.
Right. Variety creates adaptability. That's the mechanism. But I want to get really granular here because we hear the word biodiversity thrown around constantly as this vague kind of feel-good environmental buzzword.
Oh yeah, like a corporate slogan.
Exactly. But how does it actually function as a survival tool during a crisis?
We need to look at a concept called response diversity. Let's move from the forest to the ocean for a second. Think about the massive coral bleaching events in the Great Barrier Reef.
Okay.
When ocean temperatures spike, corals get incredibly stressed. They expel the symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae that live in their tissues and basically provide them with food. That expulsion is what we call bleaching.
And if the water stays too hot for too long, the coral literally starves to death.
Exactly. Now, if a reef is functionally a monoculture, meaning it's dominated by just one type of fast-growing coral, like, say, the branching staghorn corals, a single heat wave will wipe out the entire zip code.
Because they all react the same way.
Right, 100% mortality. Every single organism has the exact same thermal tolerance.
They all have the exact same vulnerability.
But in a highly biodiverse reef, you don't just have branching corals. You also have massive boulder corals, brain corals, plating corals.
So a whole mix.
A huge mix. And mechanically, they have different tissue thicknesses, different energy reserves, and different relationships with those symbiotic algae. So when the heat wave hits, the branching corals might bleach and die. But the massive boulder corals, which have thicker tissues and can sustain themselves slightly longer, they might survive.
So the system takes a massive hit, but it doesn't flatline.
Precisely. Because the boulder corals survive, the three-dimensional physical structure of the reef is maintained, which means the fish still have places to hide. The entire ecosystem doesn't just collapse into a flat, dead rock. The variety of responses to the exact same threat is what saves the system.
This immediately makes me think about how we build human systems and, honestly, how poorly we do it. Because we don't reward response diversity at all. We reward hyper-efficiency.
Oh, absolutely. Efficiency is the enemy of resilience.
Think about global supply chains. A few years ago, the entire corporate world was obsessed with just-in-time manufacturing.
Right, stripping out all the fat.
Exactly. Why have 3 different suppliers for a microchip paying slightly higher prices when you can use one mega supplier, strip out all the redundancies, and maximize your profit margin today?
It is the exact corporate equivalent of planting a monoculture forest. I mean, it looks incredibly impressive on a quarterly earnings report. It is peak performance under ideal conditions.
But the second the environment changes, a pandemic hits, a canal gets blocked by a cargo ship, a geopolitical conflict erupts, that specific vulnerability is exposed. And because there is zero response diversity, the entire global supply chain collapses in a matter of weeks.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, to you, the learner listening right now, the real question is, have you built a just-in-time life?
Oh, wow. That's a great way to phrase it.
Have you hyper-optimized your schedule, your skill sets, and your identity to be maximally efficient under perfect conditions, but incredibly brittle under stress?
That is a terrifying question because society tells us to specialize. Pick a lane, go all in. If you are an accountant, be the absolute best accountant, work 80 hours a week, and derive all your self-worth from that one axis.
Which works beautifully until the artificial intelligence software arrives that does 80% of your job or your firm downsizes. If your entire internal ecosystem is built on one species of identity, the heat wave wipes you out entirely.
So the translation of Holling's work here is that we actually need a buffer. Redundancy isn't a waste of resources. It is literally the currency of survival.
We need a biodiversity of identity and coping strategies.
Right.
You need to be professional? Yes. But you also need to be a community member, a runner, a terrible but enthusiastic painter, a friend, a reader.
We need multiple nodes of meaning.
Exactly. So when the branching coral of your career takes a massive hit, the bolder coral of your community ties and your personal hobbies sustains your psychological structure. You don't collapse.
Okay, I am completely sold on the mechanics of this. We need the release phase to prevent brittleness, and we need a diverse array of responses to survive the release phase. But, and I have to push back on the timeline here.
Okay, where's the friction?
Because we are talking about nature, and nature has a luxury that human beings absolutely do not have: deep time.
The time frame of recovery.
Right. Nature has thousands of years to regrow a forest. If my life burns to the ground, I have a mortgage to pay next month. I have kids to feed today. I understand that adaptation works, but how do we reconcile the sheer glacial pace of it with the actual demands of human existence?
This is where we need to look incredibly closely at the mechanics of the reorganization phase we talked about earlier. Let's go back to an even more extreme example than a fire. Let's look at Mount St. Helens.
Okay. A volcanic eruption?
The ultimate blank slate.
Right.
The landscape wasn't just burned, it was buried under feet of pumice and sterile ash. Zero organic matter. No nitrogen in the soil. Nothing. To the human eye, looking at that timeline, it seems totally hopeless.
It looks like the moon.
Exactly. But Holling's framework asks us to look at how progress actually functions when you are starting from zero. It is gradual, yes, but it is mechanistically powerful.
How does it actually start then? Because a pine tree can't just drop a seed on sterile pumice and expect it to grow.
Exactly. This is the role of the pioneer species. In Mount St. Helens, one of the primary pioneer species was a small purple flower called the prairie lupine. And lupines have a biological superpower. They are nitrogen fixers.
Wait, explain how that works mechanically.
So the air around us is roughly 78% nitrogen. Plants desperately need nitrogen to grow, but they can't absorb it from the air. They need it in the soil.
Okay.
Lupines have these specialized nodules on their roots that house bacteria, and these bacteria literally pull nitrogen gas out of the air and convert it into ammonia down in the soil.
So they're basically manufacturing the biological foundation out of thin air?
Yes. They grow, they live their short little lives, and they die, dropping organic matter into the sterile ash. Slowly. Incredibly slowly, they create a tiny pocket of actual soil. And it is only after generations of lupines do this totally invisible, unglamorous biochemical labor that a more complex plant can even take root.
Wow.
And only after the complex plants arrive can the insects arrive, and then the birds, and eventually the large mammals like elk.
See, here's where it gets really interesting for human psychology. When a volcano goes off in our lives, a divorce, a massive health crisis, a profound loss, we are standing in the sterile ash, demanding that the elk and the ancient pine trees return immediately.
We demand the complex joy and the fully realized new identity before we've even allowed the lupines to do their work.
Yes. We want instant neuroplasticity. We want to read one self-help book and suddenly have our trauma perfectly resolved. And when we wake up 2 months after the disaster and we still feel empty, we think we are failing.
But ecologically, you are exactly on schedule. If we map the pioneer species to human recovery, the lupines are the incredibly small, almost imperceptible habits.
Like what?
It is drinking a glass of water, it is taking a 10-minute walk, it is getting out of bed at the exact same time every day, even if you do nothing else.
It's the unglamorous biochemical labor.
Exactly. You look at those tiny actions and your ego says, well, this isn't fixing the massive crater in my life. This is pointless. But biologically, those tiny routines are fixing the nitrogen in your psychological soil. They are laying the neurochemical groundwork. You simply cannot force the complex joy to return until you have stabilized the baseline environment.
That removes so much of the shame of the barren phase. The ash isn't a sign of failure. It is the mandatory starting point for the pioneer species. But, this implies that healing and progress don't look like a straight, accelerating line on a graph. It implies a fundamentally different geometry to how we move forward.
This raises a really important question about our cultural obsession with linear progress. Holling's concept of panarchy, which kind of expands on the adaptive cycle, shows us that nature operates exclusively in nested cycles.
The cycles over straight lines.
Always. Let's contrast two natural forces. We've talked a lot about sudden violent trauma, fires, volcanoes. But look at the persistent cyclical power of a river carving through bedrock. The Grand Canyon wasn't formed by one massive cataclysmic tsunami.
Right.
It was formed by the cyclical, seasonal flow of water, returning over and over again, applying slow, persistent pressure.
And the seasons themselves are the ultimate proof of this cyclical geometry. But, and this is the human element again, we humans hate cycles when it applies to our own growth.
Oh, we despise them.
I was actually talking to a friend recently who has been dealing with clinical depression for years. They had 6 really good months, like thriving. And then suddenly they had a major depressive episode. And they were absolutely devastated, not just by the depression itself, but by the meta feeling that they had lost all their progress.
Yeah.
They felt like they were completely back at square one.
Because they were evaluating a cyclical experience using a purely linear metric.
Precisely. If you expect your healing to be a straight line moving up and to the right, a regression feels like you've fallen completely off the chart.
Let's apply the geometry of the seasons to that scenario.
Yeah.
In a linear view, winter looks like a massive error. The leaves fall, the ground freezes, all the visible growth stops. It looks like the system is dying.
Yeah.
But biologically, winter is the conservation and release phases doing their necessary work. The trees are pulling their sap, their energy, deep down into their root systems. They are actively shedding the foliage they can no longer support.
So they are actively choosing dormancy to survive. It's an action, not a failure.
Yes. Without the deep freezing rest of winter, there is simply not enough stored kinetic and biological energy to produce the explosive blooming of spring. Winter is not a mistake. It is a mandatory structural requirement for the next phase of growth.
So, to you, the listener, what season are you actually in right now? Because if you are evaluating yourself using a linear corporate growth model, you're going to feel like a failure. If you are in a personal winter, if you are grieving or exhausted or your external output has just plummeted and you are berating yourself for not producing the blooming energy of spring, you are literally demanding a flower from frozen ground.
It is a profound mismatch of expectations. You have to allow the cycle to turn. The river doesn't carve the canyon by rushing faster. It carves the canyon by refusing to stop flowing season after season.
I want to pivot to the practical application here. Because we've analyzed these massive macro-level theories, the adaptive cycle, the Yellowstone fires, coral reef response diversity, pioneer species in volcanic ash, the panarchy of seasons, it is heavy, complex science. But how do we actually operationalize this on a random Tuesday when we are just trying to get through the week?
Right.
How do we practice this blueprint?
The brilliant thing about ecology is that it scales perfectly from the macro to the micro. You don't need to visit a national park to observe these mechanics. You can see them on a sidewalk. The absolute best way to train your brain to adopt this nonlinear adaptive mindset is to observe nature operating in highly compromised environments.
Right. Because we tend to think of nature as these pristine, untouched wilderness areas. But some of the most profound examples of resilience are totally urban.
Look at the peregrine falcon. Historically, they nested on high cliffs, diving down to hunt. But as human cities expanded, their natural habitats were encroached upon. Did they go extinct? No. They adapted to skyscrapers.
Because a skyscraper is.
A skyscraper is functionally just an artificial cliff with a massive updraft. And cities are filled with pigeons. So the falcons recognized the new environment, adapted their nesting behaviors, and thrived in the concrete canyons.
Or look at the classic example of a weed, like a dandelion or a piece of crabgrass shoving its way through a crack in a concrete sidewalk. That is a terrible environment for a plant.
The worst.
The soil is compacted, it's incredibly hot, there's chemical runoff, and it gets stepped on constantly.
It is the literal definition of grit. And the cognitive value of observing that weed in the concrete or that falcon on a high-rise is that it destroys the human excuse of needing perfect conditions.
Wait, expand on that. What do you mean by human excuse?
Well, we often tell ourselves, I will finally write that book or get in shape or, process my trauma when things calm down, when I have the perfect morning routine, when my environment is pristine.
Right, the I'll do it when everything is perfect mindset.
But observing urban ecology proves that life does not wait for perfect conditions. Life insists on continuing, making absolute maximum use of whatever fractured, hostile environment it currently occupies. You can be the plant in the crack. You adapt to the concrete.
That leads directly into a very specific cognitive tool that we can extract from all of this.
Right.
When you are facing a sudden shock or a really frustrating challenge, the practice is to pause and ask yourself a very literal question. How would nature respond to this?
It sounds incredibly simple, almost like a cliche mantra, but neurologically, it functions as a powerful pattern interrupt.
How so? Like, what is it actually interrupting?
It is interrupting the human ego. When a challenge hits, say, your boss harshly criticizes a project you spent months on, or a major client backs out at the last minute, your default response is driven by ego. The ego's job is to protect your status.
It wants to fight back?
It wants to fight. It wants to conquer the obstacle, prove its dominance, and remain utterly unchanged. It instantly builds that hardened, brittle steel wall we talked about at the very beginning.
Right, the ego wants to be the resistance. It's high friction, high energy.
Exactly. But if you stop in that spike of adrenaline and ask, how would nature respond? You force your brain to shift from an egocentric framework to an ecocentric framework.
Ego versus ecology, I love that.
Ecology doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care about proving a point in an argument. It cares exclusively about enduring, harmonizing, and efficiently utilizing energy. If you look at that harsh feedback from your boss through an ecological lens, it is no longer an attack to be defeated. It is simply a sudden shift in the weather. It is a new environmental condition.
And nature doesn't yell at a thunderstorm for raining on it.
Nature would ask, okay, the wind is blowing from the east now. How do I bend my branches to let it pass? How do I use the nitrogen in this uncomfortable feedback to grow a slightly different root system? It seeks adaptation, not dominance.
That is an incredibly potent way to diffuse anxiety. You drop the exhausting demand to control the weather, and you focus entirely on your own structural flexibility.
Nature conserves its energy for growth, not for unnecessary ego-driven friction. And if you pair that cognitive question with the physical practice of actually getting outside, taking mindful walks where you actively look for these cycles of decay and growth, the pioneer species, the structural diversity, you constantly recalibrate your nervous system away from human panic and back toward deep biological resilience.
You are basically exposing your brain to the visual evidence that the blueprint actually works.
Precisely. You are reminding yourself that you belong to a system that has never lost a battle against time.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, pulling from Buzz Holling's incredibly dense, transformative ecological theories. Let's synthesize the absolute core mechanics of this blueprint for you, the learner.
Sounds good.
First, we completely dismantled the idea of the fortress. Resilience is not hardening yourself into brittle steel. It is the annealing process. It is accepting the release phase of the adaptive cycle, the fire, the collapse, as a mandatory mechanism to free up the resources needed for your next iteration. You must allow the force to change your shape.
Second, we uncovered the architectural secret of survival, response diversity. Just like the boulder corals surviving the heat wave while the branching corals perish, you cannot rely on a monoculture of skills, identity, or coping mechanisms. Hyper-efficiency makes you brittle. You must build redundancy into your life so that a single environmental shock doesn't cause a total system collapse.
Third, we looked at the brutal reality of the timeline through the lens of Mount St. Helens. When your life is reduced to sterile ash, you cannot demand the instant return of the complex forest. You must have immense, radical patience for the pioneer species, the tiny, unglamorous daily habits that slowly fix the nitrogen in your psychological soil.
And fourth, we replace the anxiety of linear progress with the panarchy of cycles. Healing is not a straight line up and to the right. It operates in nested loops. Do not evaluate a season of necessary dormant winter as if it were a failure to produce the explosive growth of spring. The river carves the stone through persistent cyclical return.
So, If you are currently standing in the absolute center of a wildfire, or if you are looking around at a deeply barren landscape wondering how you will ever recover, remember the fundamental law of the biological world you belong to. The system is designed for this. The fire is not the end of the forest. It is the catalyst for the seeds that have been waiting for the heat. You are built to adapt.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to really examine, building on that core concept of response diversity. We spend a lot of time analyzing how a physical ecosystem relies on a varied portfolio of species to survive a disaster. But I want you to look closely at the cognitive architecture of your own mind. What is the biodiversity of your identity?
That is the ultimate diagnostic question.
If you strip away your primary job title, your current relationship status, and your most dominant daily routine, what is left? If the answer is nothing, you are operating a dangerous monoculture. You are one heat wave away from total bleaching. So the provocation for you today is practical. How can you begin the quiet, slow work of planting a new, completely unrelated pioneer species in your life this week?
Plant a lupine.
Plant a lupine. Cultivate a new curiosity. Foster a connection entirely outside your normal ecosystem. Learn a skill that has absolutely zero economic value. Diversify your internal wilderness so that when the next inevitable storm breaks over the horizon, your foundation is deep, varied, and perfectly equipped to bend, endure, and ultimately reorganize.